Hello, welcome to Pondering in the Pines. So today we're going to be finishing off a batch of Mugolio pine cone syrup that we've been fermenting in this jar for about 8 months now. And I kind of like these airlock jars because they give you a good way for any fermentation gases to release through the airlock on top. Small batch, definitely, especially if you're experimenting with new pine cones or different pine cones and not sure which flavor you're going to like best. But this batch is ready to be cooked and put into jars. So first thing you want to do is get all of your equipment ready. So for us today, that's going to be a strainer to strain the pine cones into the pot that the syrup is going to be cooking in, as well as our jars, storing vessels for where the pine cone syrup is going to end up after this process is completed. So let's get started. Now this is one of my favorite and probably easiest wild harvest recipes that you can make yourself. And in the springtime, I'll post a video that shows you how to really harvest these pine cones and do this process yourself. But it does take a bit of time for fermentation and maximum flavor to transfer into your syrup. But so we're just going to dump the pine cones into the strainer and make sure we get all of that syrup, or as much as possible, off of these. This is going to be pinon pine cone. It's one of my favorites. I'm also particularly fond of the bristlecone pine cones for flavor, more of a deep vanilla flavor. This one, for these pinon pine cones, it's actually going to be one of my favorite things for glazes. So you could put it in tea, you could put it on pancakes, or definitely will bump your charcuterie board game up a little bit. Fantastic with cheeses. But as a glaze for salmon, as a glaze for venison, or as a glaze for elk, it's kind of unparalleled. So that's pretty much strained out. And we're just going to set that to the side for now. So when you're making these initially, you're essentially layering pine cones with brown sugar and pine cones, brown sugar and pine cones, until your jar is full. And depending on the moisture content of the pine cones, you're left over with this layer of brown sugar. So we do want to recapture some of that because it's going to go into your pine cone syrup. Now, not all of this leftover brown sugar is going to be put into this mixture because you don't want your syrup to crystallize. And we want it to be thick, but we don't want it to be too thick. We want it to be a nice syrup consistency. So at least a couple of spoonfuls of this leftover brown sugar at the bottom is going to go into this mix. And then whatever you have left over, don't throw it away. You can use it as flavoring for baking or cookies. It also makes a nice flavoring addition to pie crusts, I've discovered, depending on what kind of pie you're going to be making. Alright, so we'll set that to the side for now as well. Go ahead and fire it up. Now this process is something that doesn't take very long, realistically, because what we're doing with the cooking is stopping any fermentation that's still occurring. So you're getting rid of any live yeasts left over from the pine cones, as well as thickening up the syrups and removing a little bit of moisture content. So you only really want it to achieve a boil for about a minute to a minute and a half. Too long of a boil, and as it cools down, the sugars inside the mixture will crystallize and condense, and that's really not something you want as a syrup, because instead of a syrup you get a candy at that point. So we'll let that cook down. As this cooks down, you do want to stir it occasionally so that the sugar that you added from the bottom of your jar back in dissolves evenly throughout the mixture. And again, this is one of my favorite and easiest wild harvest recipes. But there are a couple little things that you should be aware of when you're doing this, because not all pine trees are safe to make syrup from. So for instance, there's a couple pine cones or pine trees that are actually mildly toxic. And not only are you making something delicious, syrupy, sweet treat, you're also essentially making an herbal medicine here. Because different pine cones are also going to have different properties. So definitely this is something you want to do a little research into. Bristlecone pine cones is going to be one of my favorite sweeter flavors for this recipe. But those bristlecone pine cones also do have anti-parasitic properties. And there's other pine cones that have potentially some negative effects, like lodgepole pine, not super tasty, has a more bitter flavor, so nothing major there. But ponderosa pine, when cattle eat too much of the pine leaves, has been documented as potentially causing miscarriage both in cows and in sheep. So do a little homework, but pinyon pine and bristlecone pine, perfectly safe, and some of my absolute favorite flavor profiles. So these leftover pine cones can go pretty much in your compost pile or into the garbage if you don't have a compost. And I like to clean as I go. It makes it a little easier at the end of things, so you don't have syrup that's dried up and gotten very sticky on your kitchen counter or your implements. But we're getting a nice simmer happening here. So again, we do want to bring that to a rolling boil for about 90 seconds. So we have a nice boil going on now. We're going to reduce that heat just a little bit so it doesn't boil over the edges of the pot. And again, the goal here is to kill any yeast that's still active in this mixture, as well as thicken up our syrup just a little bit. I'm thinking that could use just a little bit more of this sugar in there to help with that thickening process. Also definitely adds to the glaze if you do decide to use this on salmon or venison. I haven't done it on beef yet, but I imagine it would be pretty good on pork ribs as well. A little bump up on your barbecuing. Now there's a point in this process where you'll start to get this real thick foam on top. The boiling has kind of calmed down and you have this froth that's left over on top. You do want to try and skim some of that off. You can do this with a spoon. I like to use a very fine strainer. It gets any of that particulate that's left over and floating around on top out of the mixture. That way you don't have any little pine cone pieces. Give it one more pass over here. Alright, I think we're about ready to go. definitely it's easier if you have your jars cleaned and prepped already. You do want to sanitize these jars. I did that with a pot of boiling water. And if you're gonna keep this for any real length of time, you also do want to follow some canning procedures, where this would go into an autoclave or a pot of boiling water for about 10 minutes or so, not only to flash pasteurize, but also to seal the jars extra well for storage. And this will remain good on your shelf if you do that for indefinitely. Although generally this is so delicious that it usually doesn't last for more than just a couple months. So be careful, because you are dealing with a boiling hot syrup here and you don't want to get that on you. But we're just going to fill up our jars. And I was hoping I'd get 4 jars out of this batch, but I think I'm only going to get 2, maybe 2.5. So easy peasy with that. I did get 2.5 jars. And that's kind of the ending stage of this process after between 3 and 8 months of fermenting, depending on personal preference for the strength of flavor. I do like that stronger flavor, so we gave it the full 8 months. And that's how you finish out your batch of Mugolio. So tune back in to Pondering in Pine Trees next time for more great tips on how to make these wild harvest recipes.